Hello, my Old Testament introduction students. It's been a couple crazy days with all the weather. I've been entertaining my child nonstop, so I haven't been able to get a video up. So it's in the evening, he's sleeping, so I'm going to try to make a short video for you to kind of give you an overview of 1st and 2nd Kings. All right, I have the assignment up for you where you're going to read the textbook questions for 1st and 2nd Kings. And then I have a reading assignment for you involving 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2, which is about the rise of Solomon. I think it's a fascinating bit, so I'm having you read it, and we're going to talk about it. And there's going to be a discussion board based on your impression of Solomon from those two chapters. Okay, so let's jump into 1st and 2nd Kings. All right, on the file that is going to be up on the module, I'm going to give you a couple of the story charts for 1st and 2nd Kings, so you can kind of visualize what happens in those chapters, in those books. And also, I'm going to make available a chart of the kings of Israel. And as we go through, I'll highlight the big ones you need to know. You don't have to memorize the chart or anything, but it gives you a good overview of the kings of both Israel and Judah throughout their times. All right, and I think it'll be good. All right, here's the big thing you got to know for 1st and 2nd Kings. Just like Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings was written in its final form during the exile, and it's answering that fundamental question: how did we end up in exile? And therefore, it looks back on their history, and 1st and 2nd Kings points out a lot of the problems they had in their history. Why did we end up in exile? Look at your past. You've been constantly screwing up. And when you realize that, it puts a lot of these stories into different light. 1st Kings is laid out like this. The first 11 chapters is the story of Solomon. And we all have our, our presuppositions about Solomon. Really wealthy, really wise. He was a great follower of the Lord. Later in life, he had problems with the women and the idol worship at the end. But overall, most of his life, he was pretty awesome. Well, read his story closely, and what you get is the writer of 1 Kings is telling you, yes, the wisest king in Israel's history. Yes, probably the wealthiest king in Israel's history. Yes, he built the temple, but all throughout the story of Solomon in those first 11 chapters, there's little hints that the writer is giving you to say, he was great, kind of, but yeah, not all the time. But he doesn't throw it in your face. He just throws hints out, and it makes you really assess what kind of king Solomon was. And that's one of the points. Why did they end up in exile? Look back at their greatest king, and there's a lot of things wrong in his reign. I'm not going to talk about chapters 1 and 2. That'll be for the discussion board. Other than Solomon rose to power, there were some questions about how he got to power. Let's put it that way. Those were chapters 1 and 2. Chapters 3 through 5 talk about Solomon's early reign, a lot of his greatness, how he's wise and he's rich. Chapters 6 through 8 is how he builds the temple. The only problem is that we know from 2 Samuel when David wanted to build the temple, God said, I don't need a temple. Solomon builds one anyway, and he took 7 years to build it. So at that point you're thinking, wow, that is amazing. He's really dedicated to the Lord. He took 7 years to build this magnificent temple. Then after that we're told that he spent 14 years to build his own house. Which one does he value more? That kind of thing. But anyway, chapter 6 through 8 is him talking about building the temple, which is good, but there's a little iffy there. 9 through 11 talk about his downfall. This is where he, to become more rich, he enters into more marriage alliances, and with these women he marries, and concubines, they're foreigners, pagans. To pacify them, he builds shrines and idols in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem for his marriage alliance brides, that has a bad effect on the people. If you see your king erecting pagan shrines, the populace is going to go, oh, I guess it's okay to worship pagan shrines. And because of that, by the end of chapter 11, when he dies, his kingdom is just breaking apart, so much so that after he dies, starting in chapter 12, you have the story of the rise of Rehoboam, his son. And as soon as Rehoboam becomes king, the northern tribes, led by a guy named Jeroboam, come to Rehoboam and they say, could you lay off on the hard labor that your father forced on us? Right there. Solomon put his own people into forced labor, kind of like Pharaoh. So that's what their request is, and Rehoboam says, no, I'm going to be the tough guy. I'm going to work you harder. And Jeroboam and the northern tribe said, no, you're not. We're leaving. And they the kingdom breaks up, with Rehoboam in the south as king, Jeroboam in the north. And from that point on, in roughly 930 BC, there's two kingdoms. Israel is the northern kingdom. Judah is the southern kingdom. And when you get to chapters 12 to 14, both Rehoboam and Jeroboam have problems. Jeroboam's big sin is he didn't want his new kingdom, the people in his new kingdom, to go down to Jerusalem to worship at the temple. So he erected altars, pagan shrines, in Dan and Bethel, I believe. And 2 golden calf shrines. Where did they get that idea from, Mount Sinai? In the north, they had golden calf worship. They were worshiping the Lord, Yahweh, but they were worshiping golden calves. So right then, throughout the entire history of Israel, northern kingdom of Israel, they always say the northern kings continued in the sin of Jeroboam, meaning they kept those going. That's why in the first and second kings, not one Israelite king is considered good, because they always had the golden calf shrines. Meanwhile, Rehoboam, Solomon's son, wasn't too great either. He had high shrines in high places, pagan shrines. He even had male prostitutes in the temple. Not good. And so, chapters 15 and 16 is just, the writer goes back and forth between, here's a couple of northern kings, here's a couple of southern kings, this is what they did. Most of them are bad. The one in particular that you have to know is mentioned in 16, but it really takes you from 17 all the way to the end to chapter 22. That's the northern king Ahab. He's married to Jezebel. And in 17 to 22 is basically Ahab versus Elijah. At this point, this is the prophet Elijah. He's alive during the reign of Ahab. And this is the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, whether or not rain would come down or the fire would come down to the altar. Obviously, the prophets of Baal fail to do so. Elijah's God, the true Lord of Israel, does. And so there's that tension between the true prophet of God and the pagan northern Israelite king. Anyway, there's a lot more about Ahab and his horrible reign. He's considered one of the worst kings. He kills a guy named Naboth just to get his vineyard. Technically, Jezebel has the guy killed so Ahab can take the vineyard. A lot of bad things happen with Ahab. That takes you through 1 Kings. If you look at the king chart, these are the kings I really want you to know. You can highlight them. Obviously, Saul, David, and Solomon. As far as the kings of Israel are concerned, I want you to be able to know who Jeroboam the first is, because he's the first one. That's number one. Ahab is one you need to know. Jehu is great in a bad way. I'll say something about him in a second. So you want to know Jehu, number 10. So Jeroboam, Ahab, Jehu. Jeroboam the second is also a pretty big, he was one of the most successful kings, as you can tell, reigning for 41 years. Those are the big ones you need to know. We'll say more about the others in passing. The kings of Judah that you want to know are Rehoboam, and then also the big three is Ahaz, well, big four: Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, and then Josiah. And we'll say more about them in 2 Kings. All right. So that being said, let's jump to 2 Kings and what's in 2 Kings. 2 Kings picks up after Ahab's death, and Elijah passes the torch, the prophetic torch, to Elisha. And there's some more interaction between Elijah and the king of Israel. At that time, his name is Ahaziah. Chapter 2 is the famous story where Elijah takes Elisha with him, and then Elijah goes up to heaven in a chariot of fire. Long story short, now that Elijah is gone, he was like the head of the school of prophets. Now Elisha is the new head of the school of prophets. He carries the mantle, so to speak. Okay. Now that Elisha is the main guy, everything from chapters 3 to chapter 8 is stories of Elisha. Now, we're not going to go into all the Elisha stories, but it's interesting if you compare the Elisha stories to the Elijah stories in 1 Kings, there's a lot of parallels going on. During this time, Elisha was a prophet in the northern kingdom, but the northern kingdom was pretty bad, and he did a lot of ministry to Gentiles because the Israelites were so bad. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Now, at one point, Elisha sends his servant to go anoint this guy named Jehu. Jehu was a commander in the northern Israelite army, and he is anointed to be the next king. And the story we get of Jehu in basically at the end of chapter 8, but 9 and 10, Jehu is one bad guy. You would not want to meet him in a back alley. He is bloodthirsty. But God chooses him to bring judgment upon the house of Ahab for Ahab's sins. And basically, Jehu, if you read chapters 9 and 10, he just goes on a killing spree. He kills the king of Israel. He kills the king of Judah, who happened to be visiting the king of Israel. He kills all their family members. He kills Jezebel, Ahab's wife, who is still, an older woman at that point. He has her killed by getting her pushed out of a window, going splat on the ground, and dogs eat up her body. He exterminates all of Ahab's family, and he wipes out Baal worship, because you have to realize the golden calf worship was one kind of worship. Baal worship was a different kind of worship that Jezebel brought from Phoenicia, because when she married Ahab, she brought her own Baal worship, and they enforced it on the people. And so Jehu gets rid of Baal worship. But he doesn't get rid of the golden calf worship, which is kind of interesting. But he's a bloodthirsty guy. After that, you have the story of Joash. Interesting story. 13 to 15 is just a line of various kings over and over again. We're not going to deal with them. You can read them on your own. But basically, most of them are really bad. Then in chapter 16, we're told about Ahaz. And this is a really important event. Chapters 16 to 20 are really important. I did my PhD thesis on not these chapters, but this event that it talks about. Basically, what it is this. Ahaz becomes king in roughly the mid-8th century, 740-ish, 750, in the 40s. And what happens, and it's being described in chapter 16, is what is called the Syro-Ephraimite crisis. And you've got to know that. Syro stands for Syria or Aram. Ephraimite stands for the northern kingdom of Israel. Basically what happened was this. Ahaz is the new king of Judah. That's when he's the weakest. So Israel and Aram team up, and looks like they're going to invade Judah. And Ahaz is scared. And Isaiah, yes, the prophet Isaiah is alive at this point. He comes to Ahaz and he says, "Don't worry, put your faith in the God of Israel, and he will protect you. And Ahaz says, basically, I don't think so. I'm going to go appeal to the major world power at the time, Assyria, to try to protect me. And Isaiah gets mad. This is also going to be in the book of Isaiah. But basically, because Ahaz refused to put his faith in the God of Israel, the Lord, and instead appealed to Assyria, Assyria was like a mob boss. Assyria came in and protected Ahaz and destroyed, eventually, Israel and Aram. But then they never left. And ever since what Ahaz did, Assyria was like put his boot on the back of Judah for a good long time. That's the Syro-Ephraimite crisis. After that, he calls up Assyria. Assyria does destroy Israel in 721 during Hezekiah. Hezekiah's king by then. Hezekiah is Ahaz's son. So it's during Hezekiah's reign in 721 that Israel is destroyed. All right. We're also told in chapter 17 that what the Assyrians did when they destroyed Israel, they took the Israelites, scattered them throughout their empire, moved in foreigners, and the result is eventually going to be known as the Samaritans from the New Testament times. The few Israelites who were left in the land eventually intermarried with the foreigners that were brought in, and the descendants eventually became the Samaritans. Chapter 18 to 20 is the story of Hezekiah. Basically, here's the long and short of it. Ahaz, during the Syro-Ephraimite crisis, asked for Assyria's help. Assyria came in and never left and oppressed them. His son, Hezekiah, in 701 BC, he rebels against Assyria, and at that point the king of Assyria, Sennacherib, comes in to try to punish Hezekiah, and he does a lot of damage in Judah, but Jerusalem is spared and Hezekiah is spared. And therefore, what you see is Ahaz's lack of faith brings in oppression from Assyria. Hezekiah puts his faith in the Lord, and he is freed from Assyrian oppression. Okay, so that's what that is. The last little bit of First and Second Kings, of Second Kings 21 to 25, we're told about Manasseh, who was considered one of the worst kings of Judah. He was he repaganized everything after Hezekiah tried to reform everything. But then after Manasseh, you had the last great king of Israel, of Judah, Josiah. And you look at your timeline, you'll see Josiah comes to rule in 640, I believe. But in 627, 628, when the last king of Assyria dies, Josiah starts doing reforms, religious reforms. He's the one who not him personally, but he finds the book of the law. And he does this great reform to bring Judah back to the Lord. But then, in chapter 23, we find out that he gets killed at the hands of the Pharaoh Necho of Egypt, and he dies in 609. Okay? And as soon as he dies, think of this, 609, he dies, and within 20 years, 22 years, Judah is destroyed completely. That's how quickly things go bad. Basically, once Josiah dies, one of his sons becomes installed as the new king, Jehoiakim, but he is a horrible king. He runs into conflict with a prophet named Jeremiah, who was alive at that time, which we'll talk about when we do Jeremiah. And the new big dog on the world stage is Babylon. So to look at the dates, Assyria started to fall apart. Josiah starts his reforms. Things are looking good. In 612, Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, gets sacked by Babylon. So things are looking really good in 612, but then Josiah dies in 609. Then in 605, there's the famous Battle of Carchemish, where Babylon crushes Assyria for good, and Babylon becomes the new world power. 605, Battle of Carchemish. A few years later, in 597, Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon come to the gates of Jerusalem, and basically Jerusalem surrenders, and it's in 597 that Nebuchadnezzar takes a whole bunch of the elites, the rich and wealthy of Judah, back to Babylon with him. This would be the setting of Daniel, by the way. Ezekiel is taken in this first deportation in 597. And then within 10 years, the last king of Judah, Zedekiah, is an idiot, and he rebels again against Babylon. And so 10 years later, Nebuchadnezzar comes back, and that's when, in 587, he takes everybody into exile, destroys Jerusalem, destroys the temple. All right, so that's what 1st and 2nd Kings is about. So again, to take it back to where this started, if you were a Jew in the exile, you want to know, why did we end up in exile? And then some scribe writes 1st and 2nd Kings, basically saying, you want to know why you're in exile? Here's why. And then you read it, just like this short little video, a lot of bad things happened. That's why you're in exile. All right. Anyway, do the assignment. I'll have the files up with the story charts so you can follow along. Take time to read 1st and 2nd Kings in their entirety. It's wonderful, shocking, but wonderful stories. They're very engaging. So, all right. Thank you very much.